When most people hear the number $100,000, they react in one of two foolish ways. They either treat it like nothing because it is not millions, or they treat it like everything because it sounds larger than anything they have ever consistently held. Both reactions are emotional. Neither is precise. And money, if you are serious about freedom, should be handled with more precision than that. If I were sitting across from you at a plain table with your checking account, your brokerage statement, your monthly bills, and the truth of your life spread out in front of us, I would begin with a sentence that many people do not want to hear. If you have $100,000 and still feel trapped, the problem may not be the amount. The problem may be the way you think about the amount. That is not an insult. It is a diagnosis. I have spent most of my life around capital, and one of the great advantages of age is that it teaches you how often people mislabel their real problem. They say they need more money when what they really need is less structural stupidity. They say they need a better salary when what they really need is a lower burn rate. They say they want wealth when what they actually want is control over their time. They say they are poor when the deeper truth is that they have built a life whose appetite expands faster than any income they are likely to earn. Those are different problems, and if you confuse them, you can spend decades solving the wrong one. That is what I want to help you avoid, because $100,000 is not just a number. It is a threshold, not a magical threshold, not a lottery threshold, not a cinematic threshold, a mathematical one. And if you understand what changes when you cross it, your whole relationship with money can become more rational, calmer, and much more powerful. But before I explain why that threshold matters, I need to clear away one of the most expensive illusions in modern life. The illusion is that income and wealth are close cousins. Sometimes they barely know each other. I have watched people earning $300,000 a year behave as if they were free, while living inside an economic prison of their own design. I have watched other people making a fraction of that amount quietly build a life with far more resilience, more optionality, and more room to breathe. The public almost always admires the wrong one first. It sees the large salary and assumes the game is already won. The problem is that salary is only one half of the equation. The other half is the machinery that consumes it. I knew a man years ago who made a splendid income by ordinary standards. He lived in the sort of neighborhood that announces success before you even get to the front door. He drove the sort of car that made people assume he understood money. He had every outer sign that the culture teaches people to call a rival. Nice house, impressive address, proper schools, clean reputation, good restaurants, expensive calendar from a distance. He looked financially secure. Up close, he was one disrupted paycheck away from severe stress. That is not wealth. That is a high-earning job wearing expensive handcuffs. Once we laid the numbers out plainly, the truth was brutal but simple. He had built fixed obligations large enough that most of his income was already spoken for before the month had even begun. Housing, insurance, cars, taxes, maintenance, school, upgrades, memberships, lifestyle obligations, disguised as normal adult life. The result was that his income did not create optionality. It merely financed a large machine that required constant feeding. His life looked abundant. His choices were narrow. Now compare that with a second person I knew. Lower income, smaller apartment, used car bought with cash, fewer visible signals of status, much lower fixed costs. No need to perform prosperity on command. From the outside, many people would have ranked him lower in the social order. From the inside, he was much closer to freedom. Why? Because freedom is not measured by how much comes in. It is measured by how little must go out for the system to remain standing. That is the first principle. A large salary can be a gift or a trap. A modest salary can be a limit or a launch pad. The deciding variable is not income alone. It is the relationship between income and structure. This is what most people never calculate honestly. They know what they earn. They have only a foggy idea of what their life costs to maintain. They know the headline numbers. They do not know the true operational cost of being themselves. And until you know that, you cannot know whether you are building well. I want to put that differently because it matters so much. There is a profound difference between spending money and deploying money. Spending money is what most people call living. Deploying money is what people do when they understand that every dollar has a future attached to it. The culture tries very hard to hide this from you. It tells you that higher income means you have earned the right to increase your visible standard of living. It tells you that every promotion deserves an upgrade. Better home, better car, better clothes, better vacations, better proof, better symbols, better ways to reassure other people that your life is moving upward. This is one of the most expensive lies in the modern economy, because the human brain is wonderfully efficient at converting luxuries into necessities. You buy something once, then again, then again. After a few months, it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like the baseline. The upgraded apartment becomes normal. The expensive vehicle becomes normal. The premium version of everything becomes normal. Then the life structure built around those decisions demands to be defended as if it were essential. That is how people become servants to their own improvements. I have no objection to comfort. I am not arguing for hair shirts and cold soup. I am arguing for honesty. A thing can be pleasant and still be expensive in a way that delays freedom by years. That delay has a cost, and I do not mean only the obvious cost in dollars. I mean the cost in time. Time is the variable most people are secretly trying to buy, even if they do not say it that way. This is one reason I dislike vague talk about getting rich. Rich is too social a word. It depends too much on what the neighbor has, what the friend posts, what the colleague drives, what the room seems to reward. Rich is a comparison. Freedom is a calculation. The calculation is straightforward. How much of your life must be sold every month to maintain your present structure? That is a more honest measure of where you stand. A man earning a large income but spending nearly all of it is not far ahead in the game that actually matters. A man earning less, saving consistently, and keeping his fixed costs low may be much closer to the point where work becomes a choice rather than a sentence. This is why I say $100,000 matters so much. Not because it makes you rich in the way television uses the word, because it changes your mathematics. Below that threshold, most people live in a nearly linear exchange. They trade time for money in a fairly direct, tired, repetitive way. More work, more pay, less work, less pay. The system is tightly coupled to their labor. But as capital grows, the relationship begins to change. At very small level, investment returns are emotionally almost invisible. A person with $10,000 invested at a reasonable return may technically be making progress, but the actual numbers do not yet alter daily life in a meaningful way. The account grows, yes, but it grows so quietly that the owner still feels as though he alone is dragging the entire machine forward. That stage is discouraging. It is one of the reasons many people quit too early. The account exists, but it does not yet feel like an ally. At $100,000, something important changes. The capital base becomes large enough that the returns begin to matter in ordinary human terms. Not enough to retire on, not enough to impress fools, enough to be felt, enough to cover real categories of enough to create the first hint that money is starting to do some work while you are not actively producing it. That is the threshold, not the final victory. The first meaningful decoupling. This is what I mean when I say $100,000 is not mainly about wealth theater. It is about optionality. Optionality is one of my favorite words in finance because it is so much closer to truth than status. Capital creates options. Options create bargaining power. Bargaining power creates freedom. Freedom alters the shape of a life. You can wait for a better offer. You can survive a bad month. You can say no more often. You can endure a period of bad market mood without panicking. You can take a calculated risk. You can improve a skill. You can back yourself. All of that becomes more likely once you have a base. And the base begins being meaningful around that first six-figure threshold, provided you do not immediately destroy it by confusing access with invitation. That last point is critical. A great many people reach $100,000 and immediately start fantasizing about what it can buy. That is the wrong question. The right question is what it can produce if left intact. If you treat that first serious base like spending money, you have misunderstood the whole game. It is not a pile of cash waiting to be enjoyed. It is an engine waiting to be protected. That is the mental shift. Most people never make it. They see six figures and start thinking like consumers again. Bigger car, better house, celebration trip, proof, reward, permission. They tell themselves they earned it. In a narrow sense, perhaps they did. In a larger sense, that impulse is often the exact reason freedom stays far away. Because the system is not yet finished. The first serious capital base should be treated like productive equipment, not like winnings. If you owned a machine that produced cash flow, you would not tear pieces off it for temporary pleasure, just because the machine had become valuable. You would protect it, maintain it, expand it, keep it producing. Yet people do the equivalent every year with their savings. They hit a milestone and immediately begin nibbling at the principal because they cannot resist converting progress into lifestyle. That is one of the quiet tragedies of personal finance. People celebrate by weakening the thing they most needed to strengthen. So let us speak plainly. If you have $100,000 and you want it to change your life, the principle must become sacred. Not emotionally sacred in some mystical sense. Operationally sacred. It is there to build, not to entertain you. The returns can someday be used. The capital base itself should be thought of as the foundation of your freedom machine. Once you start thinking that way, your decisions improve immediately. You stop asking, what can I buy? You start asking, what does this do to my optionality? That is a far better question. In fact, it may be the single most useful question in all of personal. What does it do to my optionality? Lease the luxury car. What does it do to my optionality? Take the expensive vacation. What does it do to my optionality? Invest in a skill. What does it do to my optionality? Reduce a recurring fixed expense. What does it do to my optionality? Hold the capital base intact. What does it do to my optionality? Once you begin filtering decisions through that lens, the world looks different. Things that once looked harmless begin revealing their true cost. Not only their purchase price, their future cost, their maintenance cost, their mental cost, their time cost, their freedom cost. This is another place where the culture miseducates people. It teaches them to think in transaction terms. Can I afford? That is a childish question. Adults should ask, what does this commit me to tomorrow? There is an enormous difference between those two questions. A person can often afford something today in the narrow sense that money exists in the account. What he cannot afford sometimes is the longer chain of consequences, the monthly payment, the ongoing subscription, the increased insurance, the new maintenance burden, the upgraded neighborhood, the social expectation that follows, the job dependence required to keep the new standard alive. That chain is what traps people, not the object by itself. The chain. I have always found that the people who become free are the ones who are willing to look at that chain before they act. Now, let me introduce an idea I think more people should keep close to them. Your freedom number not your vanity number, not the number that would make strangers think you are impressive, not the number that sounds nice at a cocktail party, your actual freedom number. How much capital would be required at a conservative real return to fund your life without requiring you to sell your time in the market? That is the relevant calculation. Everything else is noise. Notice how quickly the question turns from income to expenses. This is why people misunderstand freedom so badly. They think freedom is mainly about earning more. Sometimes earning more helps greatly. I have no quarrel with ambition. But the denominator of the equation, the life you insist on financing, matters at least as much as the numerator. If your lifestyle costs $40,000 a year, your freedom number is much lower than if your lifestyle costs $120,000 a year. That sounds obvious. Yet millions of people act as though spending is a side detail and income is the whole story. It is not. In fact, expense structure is often the easier lever. Your income is influenced by market rates, competition, geography, industry, timing, health, opportunity, and 1,000 other variables. Your expense structure is far more obedient if you are willing to take it seriously. And because it is more obedient, it deserves more attention than it usually gets. This is where one of the most powerful truths in finance appears. You can radically shorten your path to freedom by lowering the amount required to maintain your life. That is not deprivation. That is arithmetic. People hate hearing this because they are emotionally attached to the consumer structure they built while still calling themselves sensible. But if your present structure requires a very large freedom number, then every reduction in unnecessary fixed cost is functionally equivalent to adding capital. In some cases, it is even more effective than chasing a raise. A raise may take years of effort and depends on forces outside you. A lower burn rate can be created directly. Today, with judgment, I watched one family spend years chasing higher income while ignoring the absurdity of the lifestyle scaffolding they had erected. Better schools, more house, more car, more subscriptions, more convenience, more invisible luxury disguised as normal life. When we looked closely, it was obvious that shaving their structural expenses by a sensible amount would produce as much freedom benefit as a substantial raise. And without the tax consequences, career strain, and uncertainty. That is the sort of insight that changes lives. Not because it sounds glamorous, because it works. Now, I should say something that sometimes bothers people. This way of thinking is not anti-pleasure. It is anti-confusion. You are free to spend money on what matters to you. I encourage a good life, not a joyless one. But the spending should be conscious, not automatic. It should serve a life, not a cultural reflex. If you know you are trading future optionality for a present experience, and you decide that trade is worth it, fine, but most people do not make that choice consciously. They drift into it. They absorb the habits of the people around them and call it preference. That is not freedom. That is programming. A $5,000 trip is not merely $5,000. It is what that capital might have become, what returns it might have generated, what room it might have bought you. That does not mean every trip is foolish. It means every spending decision should be treated as a deployment question. Not only a price tag question, what is being surrendered in the future for the sake of this present pleasure? That is the real arithmetic. You do not have to choose austerity. You do have to stop pretending trade-offs do not exist. This brings me to another important point. Once you cross $100,000, you are no longer only an accumulator. You are entering the early stage of compounding as something you can feel. Below that threshold, the machine is still small. Above it, the machine begins giving evidence of life. The gains are still modest relative to a full freedom number, but they are no longer theoretical. That changes behavior. it changes posture. A person who has seen his capital generate meaningful monthly and annual output starts seeing money differently. He becomes less willing to waste it, or he should. He becomes less impressed by surface luxury, or he should. He becomes more protective of the base, or he should. This is why I say the milestone is dangerous as well as powerful. If treated correctly, it begins a different relationship with capital. If treated badly, it becomes the setup for another cycle of consumption and frustration. I have seen both. A man builds to 6 figures, sees it as proof that he can now loosen discipline, and within 2 years is back below the threshold because he kept reaching into the base every time life or vanity made a request. Another man builds the same base and treats it as the first serious machine in his life. He keeps feeding it. He simplifies the rest of his structure. He lets the returns add to his own effort. 5 years later, the 2 men occupy very different worlds, though they started from nearly the same place. That difference did not come from luck. It came from interpretation. One saw money as permission, the other saw money as leverage. I know which view produces freedom. Let me also say something about risk, because $100,000 changes that conversation in a subtle but important way. When you have no base, every decision feels existential. A bad bet can wipe you out because there is nothing underneath it. When you have a meaningful base, properly protected and sensibly invested, you gain a different kind of flexibility. You can pursue skill building, career changes, business experiments, and select higher upside opportunities with more calm, because failure no longer means absolute ruin. That is another form of optionality, not recklessness, breathing room. The world looks different when every misstep is no longer fatal. That is why I think so many people who feel stuck are not only undercapitalized, they are under optionality. They have built life structures that leave them so little margin that every decision must be made defensively. Defensive people rarely take the sort of intelligent, strategic risks that change a life for the better. They are too busy protecting a fragile machine. Capital changes that. It cannot eliminate all fear. It can reduce fragility. And reduced fragility is one of the greatest gifts money can give. This is why I am such a believer in systems. Human beings are not well designed for long stretches of delayed gratification without reinforcement. Our minds evolved for immediacy. The future is abstract. Consumption is concrete. That is why willpower alone is such a poor foundation. You need systems that make the right choice easier than the wrong one. Automatic transfers. Money removed before lifestyle can see it. Investment contributions that happen before your discretionary self gets involved. A checking account that receives only what is safe to spend after the future has already been paid. That is architecture. Architecture beats mood. The public romanticizes discipline because it sounds noble. Fine, I prefer systems because they work on tired days too. A household that says we will save what is left at the end of the month is usually writing fiction. A household that pays its freedom system first is dealing in mathematics. That is the difference. Once the transfer is automatic, something else happens. Life compresses itself into the smaller container you actually have available. People are amazingly adaptive. What felt impossible 3 months earlier becomes normal after 6 months. If the structure is consistent enough, that is another truth the world hides from you. Your lifestyle is more elastic than your emotions say it is. This is why savings rate matters so much. Not because it sounds virtuous, because it determines the timeline. A person who saves and invests 10% is playing a very different game from someone saving 30, 40, or 50%. The higher rate may feel uncomfortable at first. But what is the discomfort buying? Years, whole years of your life. Sometimes decades of sovereignty later when you view it that way. The trade changes shape. It is no longer 30% savings versus extra comfort. It is a more modest present versus earlier freedom. That is a serious bargain if you understand what is being purchased. I should also say something about comparison, because it quietly wrecks more discipline than most people admit. Human beings are social creatures. We compare constantly what the colleague drives, what the friend posts, what the neighbor renovates, what the sibling buys. This seems innocent. It is not. Comparison turns economics into theater. Once theater enters the room, rational resource allocation usually leaves by the back door. If your environment celebrates consumption, you will feel poorer than you are. If your environment respects optionality, you will feel richer than the culture says you should. That is why I have long believed that your information environment matters financially. Follow people who normalize spending, and you will drift toward spending. Surround yourself with people who value sovereignty, margin, and patience, and your own thinking becomes calmer. This is not about rejecting society. It is about selecting influences with care. You are not a machine made of pure logic. Environment shapes behavior. Wise people account for that instead of pretending they are immune. A common objection appears whenever this kind of thinking is discussed. Someone says, "This sounds too severe. Life is short. Should I really deny myself everything now for a future that may never arrive?" The answer is no. I do not advocate denial for its own sake. But I do think that argument is usually framed dishonestly. The real choice is not between joy and discipline. The real choice is between unconscious spending and conscious prioritization. Research on life satisfaction has shown for years that beyond a certain comfortable level, more consumption adds surprisingly little. What continues to matter is autonomy, control, purpose, reduced stress, meaningful relationships, and the ability to shape your own time. Those things are much closer. That is why I say freedom is a better metric than rich. Rich is vague, freedom is operational, and $100,000. If protected and understood correctly, is the first stage where the operation begins to change. Not enough to stop completely, enough to begin feeling the difference, enough to realize that capital can now participate in carrying the load, enough to understand that the game you are playing is no longer the same as the one played by the person living entirely from one paycheck to the next. Enough to see that the next increments will often come faster because the base has become meaningful. This is the beautiful part of compounding once it begins feeling real. Going from 0 to 100,000 is hard, very hard for most people. It requires discipline without much visible applause. It requires behavioral consistency. It requires saying no often enough that you begin feeling strange in a culture organized around. Yes, but once the base exists, the next layers are aided by both savings and returns. The machine begins helping the operator. That is the phase transition. You are no longer only stacking dollars. Your dollars are recruiting more dollars. This is why I want you to treat the first 6 figures with such seriousness. It is not enough to reach it. You must understand it. You must know why it matters. You must know what it changes. You must know what will destroy it. And most of all, you must know what you are optimizing for. If you are optimizing for normal, you will probably spend it. If you are optimizing for appearance, you will probably weaken it. If you are optimizing for short-term relief, you will probably compromise it. If you are optimizing for freedom, you will protect it. That is the whole difference. Not intelligence, not luck, not secret information, priority. So if you came to me today and said, "Warren, I want to build a life that actually feels free someday, where should I begin?" I would say this: know what your life really costs. Reduce what does not truly serve you. Raise your savings rate as high as you can without breaking the system. Automate the future before the present gets a vote. Treat $100,000 not as spending power, but as the first serious engine of optionality. Guard the principle, Feed the machine. Ignore the status game, and remember that money is not there to make you look successful. It is there to buy your time back from the marketplace. That is what wealth is for. Not to impress strangers, not to flatter insecurity, not to prove that you can consume at the same pace as the people around you. Its highest use is freedom. Freedom to wait, freedom to choose, freedom to rest, freedom to change direction, freedom to stop selling every waking hour simply because the bills you built for yourself keep demanding tribute. A person who understands that will think very differently about $100,000. He will see it for what it is. Not a finished fortune, a foundation. And foundations, if respected, can hold up entire lives.